To remove the stub axle, and I've seen people use a slide hammer to pull it out from this end when it's attached to the vehicle. I don't have that luxury here, so I'm going to pound on it from the other side, and I'll flip it around and show you what that looks like. So I'm not going to just pound on the end of the stub axle here, because it will deform the end of the axle and will also damage the threads. Ask me how I know. Now, after I removed the original nut was destroyed because it was peened against this flat edge. So I have a replacement nut, and I'm going to put it on backwards because it has this nice big flat flange. And I'm going to tighten it down to where it's flat with the end of the stub axle. And then, I'm not going to pound on that either. I have a piece of wood that I'm going to place on the end of that and then bang on it with a nice big hammer. So that took about 8 minutes of pounding with the sledgehammer on the wood. But the nut and the threads were not damaged, which was the goal. And there we have it out. And here is the inner spacer ring. Now we gotta get this bearing off. So unfortunately my bearing puller is not long enough to get underneath this bearing and use the top for leverage. But if you tighten down this bearing separator enough, it'll pop this bearing up a little ways because it's tapered down in here. And maybe then I'll have enough leverage, or my bearing puller will be long enough to get the rest of it. Not see it looking like this in the pictures, but I think it'll work. All that's left is to get the inner bearing and seal out. And to get the seal, I pry it up with a pry bar, hammer it back down a couple times with the chisel to loosen it up, and only after a couple minutes it should come out pretty easily. just like that. Now with the inner seal out, you can see the inner bearing. And in order to get the inner bearing out, you have to drive it through from the other side. So now you're looking at the inner bearing from the other side. And as you can see, there's a little indentation in the housing here that lets you get at the edge of the bearing. There's one on either side, 180 degrees from each other. And I'm just going to take this brass drift that you can see me pointing at the little notch, and I'm going to tap it out, going side to side, a couple taps on each side to try to get it driving out evenly. Now past experience tells me I don't have to hit this too hard to get it out. So I'm just going to maybe light to medium 2 taps on one side, then 2 taps on the other, again to try to get it going out evenly so it doesn't bind. And it's out. Now I have used a screwdriver before. It is easy to mar the inside of the hub where the bearing sits. So if you can, go with a brass drift. Let's put this back together. It's the stub axle in the freezer. It's been in there overnight. Here we have the wheel bearing wrapped in a rubber glove because I don't have a balloon, with all the air sucked out, and we're boiling it for 4 minutes to heat it up and try to get it to expand so it slides over the stub axle as easily as possible. Put some anti-seize on. Bearing on, remember the side with the seal faces the wheel studs. Now I'm putting a plastic bag over the bearing, and you'll see why in a second. Take our bearing splitter, put it on here. Looks like it's seated to me. Now the reason I put the bag on there was to make sure if there's any dirt or debris inside this steel tube that it doesn't get into the bearing. Found that out the hard way. And that little gap you see between the bearing and the base of the stub axle, that's actually a little sleeve that extends past the seal in the bearing, so that is sealed all the way. Bearings are all greased up. Make sure you follow the proper bearing greasing protocol. These 4 took me about 40 minutes to pack in all the grease I could, over and over and over again. So to drive in the inner bearing, I'm going to use the old inner bearing on top of the new inner bearing, and I cleaned up the other side and put some grease on it so I don't introduce any contamination into the new bearing. And I have this 55mm socket which lines up pretty well on top. I'm going to get it started hopefully. using a small hammer. Checking to make sure it goes in straight. Looks pretty straight still. Looks like we're in there. Let's check it. Yeah, you can see from the other side it's all the way in there. Now I'm going to add some more grease to the inside of that bearing and the inside of the hub assembly. I'm going to reinstall the stub axle. It has the bearing pressed on it. It has the sleeve reinstalled. Don't forget that sleeve. Now we're going to go with the big hammer again and try to get this to set. I think any tightening that we do in final assembly will take care of any gap that there might be, but it's pretty well down in there. So I re-greased the inner bearing that was on the stub axle after I pounded it in. Put some grease on the other side of this seal. I'm going to tap that seal into place again with my big socket. Now with the seals in, I'm going to put the companion flange on. Don't forget the washer. Now it's time to tighten it somewhere between 180 and I think it's 212, 220 foot-pounds. Somewhere around 200 is the goal. Now I do not have a 200-pound torque wrench. But I hit 100 on this one. And then I've got my breaker bar and pipe. And I'm just going to channel my innermost Mobiltech Lucky Torque Elbow and get this thing up to 200. Yeah, that's 200. And plenty of room left to peen the nut against the stub axle. So here they are, job done, I think. All told, it took about 8 hours over 2 days to do both of them. Now there is a little more resistance to spin it than there was before I started, but there's no more little noises, there's no more rattle or play at all, and I suspect that these will loosen up a little bit after some use, but both of them feel like they have about the exact same resistance. So yeah, pretty soon I'll be hanging these from the car.